China and the US are kind of trying to decouple of each other, not only economically, but then of course also politically, is certainly something that is shaping very much the global landscape. But of course there are many other conflicts. We just don't talk about them that much.
Hello, and welcome to the Swiss Money Secrets podcast, presented to you by WHVP. WHVP is a company that has been helping Americans move assets outside of the US for over 30 years. In this podcast, the listeners can expect to hear on subjects pertaining to offshore investment and investing outside of the US markets and the US dollar. Now, let's get into it. Welcome, listeners, back to the Swiss Money Secrets podcast. We're excited to be having a new episode to give to you guys and bring to you. We have a really special guest today that we're excited to have on, and we think it's a really interesting topic, discussing geopolitical risks in the geopolitical world. And his name is Beat Habegger. We'll let him introduce himself a little bit after our news meeting before we jump into the topic. But a little bit of news that happened in our office over the summer. Our team has expanded a bit. So Jamie, maybe you could fill our listeners in kind of what's been taking shape in our offices.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are very happy to have a new colleague for the time being, at least. It's our summer intern, Nicola Mora. And he's here to support us before taking on his studies at the University of Zurich, where he will be studying business administration. So he's helping us with some investment research, he's helping us with some social media, he helps us with the filing, and yeah, it's great to have a young new person here who has new ideas and brings a new spirit into the office. So we feel very lucky that we have such a motivated and dynamic person here that supports us until August.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun to have some new blood in the office, change, and it's good to get fire and motivation from the young energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. So, Beat, maybe you can introduce yourself, kind of what you do, what your background is for our listeners before we jump into this topic.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thanks a lot for having me today. I'm also excited to be here. As you already said, my name is Beat Habegger. I have different hats on professionally. I run my own firm, Habegger Strategy, after having worked for a major reinsurance company for many years, where I was, among others, responsible for political risk. So I thought that goes a bit into the topic that we will be talking about today. I'm also working at several universities here in Switzerland, at ZHW in Winterthur, in St. Gallen. And so I try to kind of combine my academic work also with some professional work for private firms, but also public sector organizations. So that's a bit the mix that I bring in, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, we're very excited. And it's a fascinating background, fascinating topics. I mean, for us working in investments, we have to have a small eye on the geopolitical movements, or certainly be watching it. But so as we jump into this, I guess a place where we could start is since World War II, there's been a big move of globalization that we've seen, and in the last few years we've heard the media talking a lot about nationalization and the growth of nationalization. So maybe you could give us some input into, do you see the shift actually trending towards nationalism, or what's kind of your perspective on the globalism versus nationalism picture in the world that we see today?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we have certainly seen a lot of shifts, a lot of changes over the last years. Started with the pandemic, but also now the war in Ukraine, the trade wars between the US and China, the tit for tat that was played for some time, and migration crisis, climate crisis. So tons of crises, tons of shifts that have reshaped a bit the geopolitical landscape. And I think the shifts that we have seen over the last years, they look so strongly because they are in quite a sharp contrast to what we have seen, maybe not back to the Second World War, but at least back to the end of the Cold War. You remember in 1980, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, so all the Eastern and the former Soviet dominated countries in Eastern Europe were liberated. So there was the kind of the victory of liberal democracy, rule of law, free market economy, and that's the time when the world started really globalizing. Also, then the ascent of China in the end of the last millennium, beginning of the new millennium, with the accession to the WTO. So we saw a very strong surge of globalization. And now this kind of globalizing trend I wouldn't say it has come to an end, but it has certainly not expanded to the same extent as it has before. And we have, and you're right, I'm not sure whether I would call it a nationalism, but what we certainly see is more protectionist tendencies, countries trying to defend a bit and protect their national economies. And so we certainly see certain changes in that direction. And not sure whether it's really a really a reverse of the globalization trend, but it's certainly a certain kind of the brakes have pushed in, and it's certainly situation has certainly changed compared to what we have seen over the last 3 decades since the end of the Cold War.
It's very fascinating. Jamie?
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I didn't mean to. I just wanted to ask, with all those, you mentioned a few conflicts, and I think the conflicts that we hear most about or see most here is, of course, the war in Ukraine, and then also the dispute between China and Taiwan. And I was wondering, are we missing out on any conflicts? I mean, I guess there's a lot of other conflicts going around, but of that magnitude, is there something else we should be watching more closely, or do you think those are really the most relevant conflicts that are happening at the moment?
Yeah, these are certainly the most relevant ones, also because they are emblematic for the power struggles that we see in the world.
Mm-hmm.
For Europe and for Europeans, and we probably share this impression, the Ukraine war was really a shock, because it's the first interstate war on European soil since the end of the Second World War. So, and many Europeans would not have thought that something like this would ever happen again. And so just the fact that such a conflict can erupt again in Europe was a shock for many people. The Taiwan conflict is a potential conflict. It's a dormant conflict. It's not something that has already started. And but of course, just the thought and the prospect that the Taiwan conflict, or the conflict around the island of Taiwan, could turn into a real war, into a hot war, with the US on the one side and China on the other side, is of course a very scary prospect, and it's something that is worrying people, I think, all around the globe. And of course, these both conflicts also are emblematic a bit for the geopolitical struggles that we see. The decoupling trend that de-risking trend, as some call it now in Europe. So the question, to what extent the East and the West, the China and the US are kind of trying to decouple of each other, not only economically, but then of course also politically, is certainly something that is shaping very much the global landscape. But of course there are many other conflicts. We just don't talk about them that much. There are conflicts even in Europe. We have the conflict in Azerbaijan and Armenia. We have many conflicts in the Middle East. The Syrian war, the war in Yemen are not over. We have conflicts in Africa, in the Sahel region, conflicts in Asia, Myanmar. We have conflicts in Latin America, especially drug-related violence, organized crime in many countries across the American continent. So tons of conflicts a bit everywhere. But of course, the conflicts that really shape the global geopolitical landscape are the ones that you mentioned at the beginning, and of course it's not a surprise then that they are on top of mind of not only of the three of us, but on top of mind of most people in Europe and the US, of course.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And so I guess shifting away from those conflicts and more of, I guess, agreements between countries, there's a lot of, if someone's paying attention to the international scene of geopolitics, there's a lot of movements for trade deals, for instance, the BRICS nations that are coming together to look to strengthen, I guess, their trade partnerships. Do you see that having these trade partnerships happening, do you see them having real effects on shifting geopolitics, as you mentioned in the power struggles? Or what picture do you kind of see when you see these formations or these discussions and plans moving forward?
And maybe if I may interrupt, you can also quickly define BRICS, because not all of our listeners may be aware what it stands for and what it really is.
Yeah, when I hear BRICS, I hear the 90s calling. So this is, I think BRICS was coined by a US investment strategist. I think it was a colleague at Goldman Sachs, if I remember correctly. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So the 5 emerging economies at the time, and he labeled them, kind of put them all into the same basket and said, well, you know, we do not only have the major US economy and the major maybe European economy, but there are also other newly emerging markets that will grow so much that they will basically be able to compete with the established markets in the near future. And actually, for some of these markets, it was not that wrong to make that statement, right? I think China has outgrown a bit this BRICS status, I would say. I mean, China is now clearly the second largest economy on this planet, and has also, of course, has not caught up with the US, not by far, but still is getting closer in terms of economic power, in terms of military power, etc. But some of these countries have also developed a bit in the reverse direction. When you look at Russia, I think Russia is a country in steep decline, economically, militarily. Not sure how you look at when we look at the Ukraine war. Many people thought before the war that it would be a matter of weeks or maybe a month or two until they get hold of Ukraine, and it didn't prove to be the case. And India, of course, has become one of is now, I think, when it comes to population, the largest country in the world. So there you see very divergent trends among these regional powers. These are regional powers, also Brazil, of course, for South America. But I do not really see exactly what their common interests are. What is really the kind of the bond that would kind of tie these countries together. So I think, of course, these countries will play an important role also going forward. But I do not think that the BRICS label or this club, they have even formed it into a club then later on. It's interesting, right? So then American investment strategists coined the term, and then this term was picked up by these powerful nations, and they even built a club around it. But I do not think that this is a club that has a strong internal cohesion, so that it's also able then to actually shape something on the global political scene. But the countries for themselves, individually, of course, they remain important economic and important political players, if not globally, then certainly in their respective regions.
Do you see those economies growing and becoming more relevant, that also on the currency side of things, that's going to lead to some changes? I mean, we have the US dollar as the world reserve currency. Probably not going to change today or tomorrow, but do you think that there's going to be a continued decline in the relevance of the US dollar, or do you think that the US dollar as the world reserve currency is going to be here to stay?
It's going to be here to stay. Or I'm not sure, of course, if we can have a very long very, very long-term view, and who knows what's going to be in 30, 40, 50 years. But I don't see, when you look back 30 years, I think you have to correct me if I get this wrong, but I think the global currency reserves are still about 60% in USD. So, and that's higher. I think that's higher than at the end of the Cold War, right? So that's it. It may be a bit lower than 20 years ago, maybe, but it's higher than 30 years ago. Also, international trades is by far, it's so heavily dominated by USD, also Euro, actually, a bit surprisingly maybe, but still. Of course, look, the Chinese, they would like to push their currency. They're also doing it, right? They're using it in their economic spheres of influence, not only in Asia, but also in Africa, for example, where they have invested heavily, especially in the when it comes to natural resources, the mining industry, etc. But I don't. When you look at the sheer numbers, I don't really see why the USD should lose its status as the key global currency reserve. So I don't think that this is something that is going to happen over the next, let's say, next 10 years or so. Further out, you never know, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, it's also a bit, I've talked about this before, it's also a bit this tension between the US and China, and the question of to what extent do these important economic powers also further diverge over the next years, and what does this then mean for economies like Switzerland, or economies that of course want to trade and want to do business with both, with China and the US, and of course if such a trend would accelerate, then that would also certainly have kind of repercussions then on the respective currencies, but at this point in time, I do not really see that the position of the US dollar could be at danger, so to speak.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting, and especially hearing you talk about a country like Switzerland, who isn't necessarily part of any of these, I guess, unions of nations when it comes to military or political connections. I guess that would be my question, is we've seen some countries apply into NATO, like Sweden, who maybe for our listeners didn't know was historically a neutral nation. Switzerland being a neutral nation, do you see this as an opportunity for Switzerland to, I guess, double down on its neutrality and serve as a strong role in that neutrality, or where do you kind of see a place of a neutral nation politically, militarily? Where do you see that in the future?
That's a tough question. Of course, the neutrality is extremely strongly anchored in Switzerland, and it's strongly anchored not only within the political elites, but it's especially strong anchored in the minds of the Swiss people. So the Swiss see themselves as having been neutral since 200 years, and to give up on such strongly held positions, and this is not just a kind of a thin majority that believes in Swiss neutrality. This is there have been surveys for many years, and they always show 80 to 90% of the Swiss people believe in the value of neutrality. So this is not going to go away anytime soon. The question, however, is what does neutrality actually mean when it comes to pursuing foreign policy, when pursuing a policy towards a country like Russia that has invaded, that has militarily invaded a neighboring state? Is it also from a moral point of view acceptable to just step aside and say, well, we are neutral, we do not take any position in such a war where it's so obvious what the aggressor is and what the victim is. And so I think that's the struggle that the that Switzerland is currently dealing with, and I'm also convinced that it's going to lead to certain policy changes in the future. But neutrality is not a policy. It's not an objective of Swiss foreign policy. It has always only been a means. It's something that we use. It's a tool that you can use to pursue a foreign policy that makes sense for a small landlocked country like Switzerland. It's a tough question, and it's not yet clear how it's what path Switzerland will take. But I'm convinced that certain changes to the neutrality policy of Switzerland will follow, but I do not believe that Switzerland will give up neutrality over the next 10 years as well.
Yeah.
10 years is always I cannot imagine that something like this would happen. But then NATO membership, I don't think so. However, maybe more collaboration, maybe also joint exercises, etc. I think that's certainly something that will be discussed in Switzerland very intensely over the next couple of years or so.
That's very interesting to hear. I wouldn't have thought about joint exercises being something that Switzerland would start to. I mean, I know that they have them, but serious joint exercises would have been something that.
Well, look, this is a small country, right? Yeah. If you want to defend the airspace, if you start in one corner of the country, you have to be careful that you are not. That you're not exiting the other end of the country when you are a bit in the air. So I mean, exaggerate a little bit, but so defending the airspace independently. How do you want to do this in a small country, densely populated, surrounded by NATO members? So can make sense to also train certain kind of joint capabilities, right? And then also be able to use them if there might be a need going forward.
Interesting. So do you, I guess that's where we're kind of coming closer to the end of the podcast, I guess. Would you have any final thoughts, or as you mentioned, you don't see neutrality change in 10 years. Where do you kind of, I guess, taking that picture a bit bigger, where do you see the world in 10 years with how things are kind of developing? Where do you see, or at least what direction do you see the world going in the next 10 years?
Well, it's even tougher question. And actually, I didn't say that the neutrality is not going to change. I think Swiss neutrality will adapt. The way we are pursuing neutrality policy will change. But I do not think that we will give up on it entirely. And for the world, I mean, this is an impossible question. What I always advise to do is to think in different scenarios, to have different alternative futures, right? Different paths into the future in mind, and try to make sure that you are setting yourself up, that you are also setting your business up, so that you can withstand any type of future development that we will see. It's always good to have a clear map understand a bit the landscape, understand what the situation looks like today, also reflect on what potential future developments could mean for your business, for you as an investor, also maybe also for you as a private individual, right? And then try to think about how can we mitigate certain negative certain downsides that could potentially occur. What do we need to do? How do we need to position ourselves? Do we need to diversify more? Do we need to increase our robustness against certain trends or certain potential future developments? I think that's the way you have to think. You don't have to try to... the crystal ball is not available, right? So you don't really see how the world... Nobody knows. So then I think the second best option is always to come up with different scenarios and make sure that you are robust enough to survive whatever may occur.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Maybe I can follow up on that a little bit before we go. I think that's a good final thought that you brought up with the idea of diversification, that also private investors have to think about how to position themselves. As you know, we're a wealth management company, so that's certainly something that a lot of our listeners and our audience is interested in. I know you're not an investment advisor. You don't have to make any investment advice in that sense, but just maybe what are some of your thoughts? How can you achieve diversification, or how can you achieve a portfolio or a personal setup that excludes certain risks? How would you go about that?
Well, you just first have to identify the risks. I mean, diversification is the bread and butter business, right? It's a bread and butter approach for any investor, I guess.
Yeah.
So do not put all your eggs into one basket, right? That's even I know this. So also a little bit of a diversified portfolio for my very minor investments. But of course, what you can also do, you can look when you also maybe also spot some interesting opportunities here or there. When the world is changing, when countries are changing, when policies are changing, this may also open up opportunities that not all the investors may see. For example, recently we had presidential elections in Turkey. President Erdogan was re-elected for, I think he has now been in office for more than 20 years. But with a new government coming in, as also a bit of a new start, so he replaced the finance minister, the head of the central bank. Now we see all of a sudden interest rates have been they were rising in interest rates quite substantially after having kind of resisted such a move for a long time. And we all know that it was President Erdogan who was primarily the roadblock. But now with the new government, also new changes, monetary policy changing, so maybe that's also opening up new opportunities in Turkey that may not have been that clear before the election. Also, what I always also find interesting is the sanctions landscape. I know this must be a headache for for you and for many of your clients or your business partners. But the sanctions monitoring a bit what's going on the sanctions landscape. See also when sanctions are lifted. Sometimes it's not always only additional sanctions, but sometimes you also have a chance that the sanctions get relaxed, and then maybe be a bit earlier than the others. That could also potentially be used to create a competitive advantage. And so that's probably not investment advice, but that's my modest advice also, how you can actually build bridges between a monitoring of the geopolitical landscape then to your investment portfolio and the strategy with which you want to grow it or defend it.
Absolutely, makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for giving your assessment on that.
Thanks again for joining us on this episode of the Swiss Money Secrets podcast. If you would like to learn more about WHVP and what we do, check us out on our website at whvp.ch. Or you can check us out on any of our social media handles on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram by simply searching WHVP. Have a great rest of your day.